Hello and welcome to Google Firestarters. I'm Neil Perkin, the moderator and the host of the series. And for the uninitiated, if you're new to Google Firestarters, this is a series of video conversations with the interested and interesting of the advertising, marketing and beyond industries, as we like to say. So today's guest is, of course, both interesting and interested. That's Rishad Tobaccowala. So Rishad is, of course, for a long time, for many years, was Chief Growth Officer at Publicis Group, now an advisor, educator, speaker, also the author, actually, of the book Restoring the Soul of Business, Staying Human in the Age of Data, which I can recommend, and a brilliant Substack as well, which is rather brilliantly titled The Future Does Not Fit in the Containers of the Past. So Rishad, if I could just ask you to introduce yourself, please.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. As you rightfully noted, I basically spent 40 years or 37 years at the Publicis Group, which is the only company I ever worked with, which is either a sign of loyalty or unemployability, which I'm not sure which. About 2.5 years ago, I started my second career as a company of one, where I write and I speak and I advise. These days, I focus on three areas: the future of work and talent, the future of marketing and media, and I'm learning about what I call the third connected age, which is what I mentioned in my book, of which Web 3.0 happens to be a subset.
Fantastic, thank you. And as you know, Firestarters is structured really around sort of 5 key questions that provide the kind of structure for it. And they're focused really on the things that you've learned in your career, mistakes you might have made, but also insights and predictions around how marketing and advertising is changing. So I'm going to get straight into the first question, if I may, Rishad. I'd just love to know, across your career at Publicis and beyond, so what's the best thing that you've learned in your career to date?
The very best thing that I've learned in my career to date is that the best way to grow yourself and to scale your company is through world-class talent. And by being able to attract, retain, and work with world-class talent makes every company and every career successful, because in effect, it's a giant Ponzi scheme that you actually are sitting on top of or alongside amazing people, and people think you're good too.
And I know you mentioned actually in your book, I think, about sort of talented workers have more bargaining power now, but also that this bringing together of talent, I suppose human intuition, as you put it, with data-driven insights. So let's get straight into that, because that's an interesting dynamic, isn't it, around talent and data?
It is. So what basically happens is, to a great extent, my background is I have an undergraduate degree in advanced mathematics. I have an MBA in finance. And I was fortunate to work with other people to start some of the digital agencies as early as 1993 and 1994. In fact, I had Sergey Brin visiting us when people didn't know who Google was, or very early in Google's days. And I truly believe that data is extremely important, and it's like electricity, which is you cannot operate without it. It illuminates the way ahead. But while it is essential and necessary, it's not sufficient for most companies to win. Obviously, companies like a Google or a Facebook or an Amazon have unique data special to themselves at scale that is amazing. Most other folks, most marketers, most other businesses don't really have that. So they, to a certain extent, require it, but the data alone will not allow them to separate themselves. And as a result, I remind people that if everybody has access to world-class data, and not really special, again, some companies do, but most companies don't, then do you ever hear of someone coming around, and if data is like electricity, that I am better than the other company because I use electricity? That only makes sense if everybody else is using steam, but everybody else is using electricity. So what I remind people is, while it is essential, what eventually separates is the storytelling. So the theme of my book is basically, you need the spreadsheet and the story. You need the math and the meaning, or the magic. And so fundamentally, we all believe that we're all data driven, but we were all born, which means somebody, which is our parents, made a bad ROI decision when it comes down to financial metrics. right? The financial metrics of a kid don't turn out to be too good, but we still get born. Most of us basically carry around or wear on our wrist a watch. Why? Your phone has a watch. Why do you buy it? We basically believe that it's all about data, but the most valuable companies in the world, in addition to companies like Google, are companies like Apple or LVMH, which do not differentiate on price. They differentiate on design and provenance and storytelling. So my basic belief is you need both of them. If you have only data, you end up with opening up fake accounts like Wells Fargo. And if you have only storytelling, you get high on yourself like WeWork. So you have to combine the two.
So do you think that companies are too obsessed with data right now? I think you talk about there's not enough focus on kind of the employee motivation and so on.
Yes. So what tends to basically happen is I believe that, and I've written, in my Substack, a piece called Reinvented Marketing, the Future of Marketing, where I try to, and obviously I don't do it. You cannot succeed in doing this, but I make a pretty good attempt at trying to look at the future of marketing in one slide. So I put it down one slide, and I basically have an ABCD, which is the future of audience, brand, content, data, and enterprise. And one of the things I remind people is let's look at something as brands. If you really want to have a world-class brand, one of those things obviously is brands are increasingly experiences. We know that, right? But another one is you can't have a world-class brand unless you have joyful employees. Sooner or later, your employees become the brand. And so as much as we focus on data, let's focus on employees. And employees, by the way, are not data driven. One of the lines I use is, yes, we are living in a data driven silicon-based digital world, but we're analog carbon-based feeling people. And so I truly believe that for companies to succeed, yes, they require data, but a data is an input. And by the way, most people think data is the answer. I say how you deal with the data is the answer. In May 2020, almost every country in the world had the same information on COVID. Why was it that New Zealand and Vietnam and Germany did it one way, and Brazil and the United States and the UK did it another way? It was the people in the room and how they read the data, right? When people talk about algorithms, I basically say somebody wrote them, okay?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, oh my God. So a lot of the reason that I think people are also fixated about data is deep insecurity that they don't understand it. So they keep talking about it, disruption and data lakes and stuff like that. And myself, can you tell you in English, how does this help your business? Again, I am a very pro data person, but my whole basic belief is if someone fixates on it, I really worry that they are missing the point.
Do you think it's interesting, isn't it? Because you hear like phrases like data driven a lot.
Yes.
I mean, do you think data driven is a good way of thinking about it or not?
Data driven with another word is probably a good way of thinking about it, which is data driven storytelling is a part of the future of marketing. But if you tell me that it's about data driven marketing, I said no. And if it's only about storytelling marketing, it's probably more correct than data driven marketing, but no, it's data driven storytelling. So, I am very pro data, but the fact simply is I have never seen data drive the answer. It's people and data drive the answer, just like the best chess players with machines will beat the machines.
And so, do you think there's there's a mindset, I suppose, isn't there? If you think about what that mindset is for deriving true value from the data, what do you think that
Yes.
is then?
So, I've written both in my book, I have a chapter called Too Much Math, Too Little Meaning. And then I've written a Substack called Between the Data and the Reality Falls the Shadow, which is basically a play off a T.S. Eliot line, poet. And in that, the mindset I basically have is what I call 6 I's and 6 P's. But the mindset is really 6 I's. And 6 I's are to actually extract meaning from data. The first thing you need to know is you need to interrogate whether the data is valid in its first place. So one of the I's is interrogate. Another one of the I's is inclusive. Bring lots of different people to look at the data. Number 3 is interpolate it with other data sources. 4th is imagine. Sometimes you have to imagine something and then see if the data fits your imagination, because sometimes the data doesn't unleash the imagination. So those are those are the mindset that I believe that comes in. So I see data as raw materials. I do not see data as the refinery, right? The refinery is the people or other things. And in most cases, for many years, it wasn't necessarily the oil field people that were making the money. It was the Exxons that were making the money. So they were the refiners.
Yeah, there's I think it was Charles Dunnhumby, I think there was a quote from him about data is the new oil, but in the sense that it's toxic unless you refine it, which
yes,
is
right. Data is the new oil, is toxic unless you refine it. And what tends to basically happen is if you use that oil and exactly the very same oil, and as I explained to people, I said, let's say you're like not paying attention and you happen to have a better car, like a good car, an expensive car. And by mistake, because you're not paying attention, you fill it with the least costly petrol or fuel. Your car will knock like crazy, and you were just filling gas at a gas pump in your car, and by putting the wrong one, you not ruined your car, but you had 2-3 hours of bad driving, right? So I said, just forget about the difference between oil for a machine, oil for an aircraft, and oil for a car, right? And so if data is the new oil and you could use it everywhere else, all of us will basically we'll die like those birds at an Exxon Valdez thing. And a part of it is, I really believe that what happened is, often I listen to people and below all of their lingo, I basically call it buzzword bingo.
Yeah.
Disruption, platform, data lakes, right? Buzzword bingo is a deep sense of insecurity, because they really sense this, they don't understand things. And I said, why don't you understand? Because once you understand, and by the way, every one of them are amazingly competent human beings.
Yeah.
Very, very capable. And my stuff is, why are you scared? You're fantastic. Just learn about this. And once you learn about it, and you can talk about it in English, you'll realize data is your friend, but data is not something to be scared about. And you don't necessarily have to basically bend your knee to the idol of data.
It's a bit like the kind of Feynman technique, isn't it? Where it's like, if you can understand it well enough to explain it to somebody else, to a child, for example, then you really do know it, because you can teach it.
It is. And one of the big things that I try to do is, that's one of the reasons I'm spending a lot of time on Web 3.0, and I just figured out a way to explain it to people in English. And once I started explaining it in English, people said, okay, this makes sense, right? Including, by the way, that Web 3.0 and metaverse are not the same thing under any circumstances. Okay. And I said, today you can run a metaverse with Web 2.0. It's basically called gaming. So what are you talking about? Right. And there's all this confusion. And it's one of those also confusions that, I was either fortunate or unfortunate to start one of the first digital agencies just when the .com bust happened. But my agencies kept working and kept growing, because I would show two lines to people. I would basically show them the QQQ, which is the NASDAQ index, which at that time was crashing from 5,000 to 1,000. And I said, if this is the way you run businesses, that's not the way I run a business. The next line I showed was basically broadband penetration in the United States.
Right.
Right. And I said, that's the future. And I said, don't think about the future of web as the price of Bored Apes or Solana or ETH, right? And then people begin to sort of realize that, and this is how you have to separate, and here's what you need to do. But the other one is, a big part of what I think a lot of people forget, and which is one of the reasons why, whether it was Substack, a lot of stuff like I'm now learning, like on Web 3.0, you have to do this stuff. So I remind people who are like middle and senior, please don't fake it. Everybody who's good knows you're faking it when you fake it. They don't fake it. Lots of senior people don't fake it. They're really, really good. But my stuff is, don't fake it, do it. Right? You'll actually learn. And those are some of the mindsets I hope to bring to people.
Great, fantastic. And so talking of learning, I'd love to move on to the second question, if that's
Sure.
all right. And that's related to the biggest mistake that you made in your career and what you learned from that. So could I ask you that?
So I make mistakes all the time, but the biggest career mistake I made actually, um, which I fixed very quickly, was I missed search for a while. Okay, so
That's in
we are
marketing.
search engine marketing, and and we fixed it quickly. So to give you an idea, we were early on lots of things. Like long before there was even social media, I had a social team, I had a gaming team called Play, I had everything. But when search happened, it took me about a year to figure out what was going on. Uh, the- Not that I was an early user of Google, etc., but to figure out from a marketing perspective what was going on.
Right.
And I tried to figure out why. We eventually fixed it, and interestingly, the way we fixed it is we basically bought DoubleClick from not DoubleClick. We basically bought Performix from Google. When Google bought DoubleClick, they had to get rid of this, probably the best search capabilities. But it took me a little time. Why? And that is why I now have written things like future doesn't fit in the containers of the past. Okay. The reason was I was fixated on clients. And not a single client was asking me about search. And almost all the initial people who were using search were either people who did not do any advertising or were using classifieds or other kinds of things, which none of my Fortune 500 companies were using. So in effect, by fixating on clients versus fixating on people, I missed something.
So I think you've written about this in terms of solving for the wrong questions almost. So
Yes.
is that because you're so what was going on there was really you were focusing in the wrong area and just
I was focusing in the
missing
wrong
something?
area. And I always remind people, and obviously I have to do this with great respect because clients pay the bills for everybody, including, even though I'm now my own person, there's somebody who hires me. So I will not bite the hand that feeds. But I do tell the hand that feeds that my real value is making sure that they keep their eyes on their customers, their consumers, versus keeping an eye on them or their competitors or their category.
Yeah.
And the big thing I learned was the opportunities and threats that come to any company tend to come from outside their definition of the category. And it's happened, like, as I mentioned, in like, you know Nokia and Sony and RIM slash BlackBerry did not see Apple. They refused to acknowledge something could happen, right? GM and BMW did not see Tesla and Uber till much later.
Mm.
And that's primarily because we tend to be, by our very nature, we fixate on our categories. So I remind people, I advise that being less pathetic than other pathetic people in your category doesn't make you great.
Yeah, it's so interesting that because it's a bit like the whole idea of best practice, isn't it? I mean, best
Yes.
practice can be useful in terms of level setting capability or processes or whatever, but actually, by definition, best practice is all about containing what you already know rather than actually looking outside of that. So, do you think organizations
Yes.
are too guilty of that?
Oh, yeah. Organizations are very guilty. Obviously, best practices are part of it. Benchmarking against competitors are part of it. But there becomes an overall fixation, including, by the way, people won't shift measurement from one measurement provider to another. For the only reason is because they've got legacy measurement that they can measure and benchmark against, in which they're bonused against.
Right.
So the whole idea is, okay, you're driving a ship based on yesterday's lighthouses because you're being, what's wrong with you? Right?
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with them. What's wrong with them is their incentive systems. So a big part of what I go in and I begin to realize, smart people do stupid things because they're paid to do stupid things, right? Which is like ridiculous, right? So my stuff is, what's your incentive system to do this silly thing, which makes no sense. But one of the big things that I always try to, because it's happened to me again and again, is remember, and I remind people, whatever you do, make sure that every 6 months or a year, you have this following exercise. And the exercise is pretend you are not working in your company, but you only are thinking about the people that you're trying to serve,
Right.
right? That you have all the assets of your company, but none of the so-called legacy things. If you only have 3 rules, then whatever you end up doing has to be legal/ethical. Whatever you have do has to be scientifically possible. And whatever you do breaks even within X number of years, X number of months. What would you do? And when I do this with clients, they come up with something that's completely different than what they currently are doing. So I said, why are you doing what you're currently doing? They said, well, because. I said, well, because you're constantly repeating the same thing. I said, I just said, you have to do something that's what you've just created is what your competitors are going to create. Your competitors always start with fresh sheets of paper, right? The future of banking isn't going to basically necessarily come only from a JP Morgan or a Bank of America. It probably will, because they're very smart people, and now they're putting billions of dollars in it. But it will come potentially, from the Chimes and the Affirms and everything else. And again and again, we forget that the future definitely does not fit in the containers of the past or the mindsets of the past. And I work very hard to try to pretend that I'm not one of those mindsets of the past, which I might be.
There's a really nice phrase actually that you use, I think, when you were writing that post, and it was about looking from there to here, not here to there.
Yes.
So what did you mean by that?
This is the whole idea of imagining, which is what is possible and how do we get to what is possible versus where we are and where are we going to go next. Okay. Because when you go from where you are to where you go next, you tend to focus a lot on your roots. If you basically start focusing a lot about where you want to be and come back, you start focusing on wings. And one of the things I talk about is successful companies and individuals combine roots and wings. But by our very nature, we tend to be rooted because humans, however much we might like to talk about change, and as you know, I write about this in one of my chapters in my book, is I believe that change sucks. Okay. And while most people say change is good, my basic belief is I'm happy. Why don't you change? Right? But change sucks because we have to learn and do new things. And so by our very nature, we might talk very big, but we don't really want to change that much because it's hard. And therefore, by starting from where we could be, it's a little bit easier because you are a little bit more free thinking.
Yeah, brilliant. So we talked about change there, which is a good opportunity to bring this into the marketing and advertising industry, and just to get your view on how that is fundamentally changing. So what's your key insight around changing our own industry?
So to me, there are 3 big shifts going on. The first is in the media industry or the media landscape, so the landscape. The second is in the broad marketing landscape. And third, even though it's a subset of those 2, the rise and what I call the age of creativity. So let me start with the media landscape, which is where I call it ruptures in the mediascape. And there are a few things. The first is the rise of what I call mongrel media. And mongrel media is if I'm watching a video on TikTok, okay, could be on YouTube, but let's say TikTok. Okay, I'm watching a video on TikTok, and I see an ad, and at the end of which there's a call to action, and I buy a product, and then I'm given a choice to pick it up at the Target or have it delivered. And I decide to pick it up at the Target. I ask marketers, what just happened there? And that's a real thing. It happened to me. Was it above the line or below the line? Because I started with a TV ad and I ended up buying something. Was it online or was it offline? I started with something on a phone and I ended up in a store. Was it social? Was it mobile? Was it e-commerce? That's what I mean by mongrel media. And I said, we have been all organized based on the way people don't use it. So the customer journey, consumer journey, people's journey has changed. And we are still talking about journey, the McKinsey model, which are all bereft and old. Nobody does it like that. I keep being shown the McKinsey model and I say, what's that? right?
Uh-huh.
Right. The media landscape is changing. There clearly is a massive new thing about what I call privacy, identity, and data, which are all completely separate things. And I remind people that just because you have some information on you doesn't mean you know my identity, because I believe we have many different people. And I've written about this. We have many different identities. Uh, and so I've been talking to people and say, think about identity very differently, especially also in the future when, assuming Web 3.0 happens, your identity may not be your email address or your Facebook sign in, it may be a wallet. So there's an entire thing about ruptures in the mediascape. So that's one. Second is the future of marketing. I believe that advertising is in secular decline and it's unstoppable. And I said this 5 years ago, when I was in fact ad publicist, and people said, what are you saying? I said, that's the reason we did our stupid strategy of buying other things, because the whole idea is advertising by itself is in that secular decline. And advertising, as if you define it as interrupted messaging, right? Um, in the last 10 years, the amount of content that is subscription based versus advertising supported has flipped from 65-35 to 35-65. So only 35% is advertising, 65% is content. Subscribed content, which is one of those key things. But as importantly, the future is in this whole idea of A, B, C, D, E. I believe when we thought about audiences, we now basically have the people who we market to start campaigns. It's not like we start a campaign and they respond to it. Sometimes they start a campaign. In the case of brands, I believe that the future of brands, in addition to being experiences, are about employees, right? When it comes down to content, who is a content company? I remind people that the Kardashians of Instagram and the D'Amelio sisters of TikTok have greater daily interaction than the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
Right. So what is that? And so those are a little bit of the future of marketing. And then finally, creativity. I'm a big believer that we're entering the most amazing age of creativity ever. In the US, 50 million people call themselves creators. And I could call myself a creator because I take a picture. I now call myself a creator because I write a Substack, but there are 50 million people who call themselves creators. And increasingly, modern technology, including many of Google's technologies, are enabling creators, right? And over time, we'll be able to, whether it's with NFTs and a whole bunch of other stuff, more money will come to the creator versus the middle person. Assuming, so again, that's the Web 3.0 philosophy, assuming it happens, okay? But one of those things is we're living in the world of creators, and we have to recognize that the first 15, 20 years of this digital world has been built on plumbing. Now we're about to move into the age of poetry. So those are my three basic beliefs, which is things like mongrel media, so ruptures in the mediascape. The future of marketing is very different, which is this ABCD of reinvented marketing, and we're entering a creative age.
So that's really interesting. I think there's a theme actually in what you were saying there about blurred lines between things. And I guess it's a challenge, isn't it, if you're a marketer trying to navigate through all of that different stuff? I mean, how do you separate the signal from the noise and amongst all of that?
It is difficult, and I work with a lot of businesses, and clearly they have to run real businesses. So they ask me, okay, that's all fine, but how do I make my shipments? How do I run my organization? Because this is not just about, writing Substacks and words and things like that. It's how do you actually deliver? Unfortunately, I had to for many years. So what I propose is a 4-step plan for them. The first is everyone should focus on people, that is their customers, their consumers, and see how they're behaving. And recognize that that is the star to follow versus any other star. The second is to look at your own organization and think about what you're doing correctly and how you may have to morph it. And in part of your morphing your organization, you want to basically think about how do you allocate between today and tomorrow, both financial resources as well as your time. And I ask most people to spend some of their time, much more of their time on tomorrow, which is 30%, even if they allocate only about 5 or 10% of the financial resources. That's the second one. The third one is, upgrading and upskilling both themselves as well as their partners and their partner organizations, or bringing in new partners, because this is eventually about learning. And what tends to basically happen is we forget that change does not happen inside an organization just because you have a strategy, a reorganization, and an M&A plan. Those happen to be what I call three parts of a six pack. But change doesn't happen unless you drink the entire six pack. And this could be a six pack of Perrier, not necessarily a beer, but you need all six. It's 4, 5, and 6, which a lot of organizations need to do, which is number 4 is explain to people why it's good for them. Why is it good for the employees? Why is it good for the partners? Number 5 is changing incentive plans. If your incentive plans are still fixated completely on how you do business today, people will not do things differently because they will do things the way they're paid. And the 6th is providing training. One of the big challenges, especially now post-COVID, but even if it was before COVID, I realized that obviously there are some organizations that have the money, like many of the digital organizations, but in many clients and many service industries, they stopped investing in training. They stopped investing, or didn't stop, but they dialed back significantly, training in people. And my thing is you have to upgrade your people, because if you can upgrade your people, the returns to talent are significant. And I actually use, obviously, most companies don't have engineers like a Google does, right? But I basically show how Google will pay a great engineer 10 times what they pay a good engineer, because the great engineers work probably 50 times better than a good engineer. And while that might not be true in the non-engineering world, it is probably true that someone who's a great employee is worth 3 times a good employee. So why don't you pay them twice as much?
Yeah, that's interesting. And there was, what you're saying there reminded me a bit of, I think there was a model which originated with Google actually, but 70-20-10, which is where
Yes.
70% of what you do is on your core job, and then 20% is on related functions, and then
10 are
10%
moonshots or whatever. Yeah.
Is that a sort of model really? As
It
an
is.
organization,
It is definitely a model. And what is happening is the key to senior and middle management, a lot of whom obviously I deal with a lot of young people. I train a lot of young people, but I also deal with a lot of C-level executives, right? And one of the things I remind them is they are amazingly talented people, and they wouldn't have got to where they got if they weren't talented, but they have to rethink and relearn again. And they have to be humble enough to start learning again, which basically means going back to school. And that is, the good ones quickly do that, and they then have another quantum jump. The others basically start faking it. And I beg them not to fake it, because what happens is, if you don't end up, it's just not thinking about this, if you don't end up doing these things, right? So, for a long time, like, I was like almost, I was definitely in my mid 40s, if not tending towards my 50s, when things like social media began to happen. And I was fortunate, I was running companies with thousands of employees. And I started like fiddling around with all these things. Okay. And people were asking me why. And I said, because I think it's interesting, I got to learn. And many of my colleagues said, hey, what doesn't matter. 3, 4 years later, many of my colleagues were asked to leave the company because clients basically said they didn't know what they were talking about, even though they were fantastic at television and other things because people changed. Now there are generational shifts at clients. And the clients I speak to are so damn smart, I'm scared to talk to them because they'll figure out how stupid I am, right? But what basically happens is, the key thing I remind them is you got to basically do. And today, some of the ways, like, people say, okay, maybe you know what you're talking about, is my Twitter handle is @Rishad. My Gmail address is rishad@gmail.com, which means, oh shit, this man was an early adopter, right? I have this huge thing on Substack. I have an NFT out on OpenSea. Why do I do that? I do that because it's the only way to learn. And that's what I encourage people. So that's the third one. And the last one, or the fourth one, so obviously, there's the allocating of time, partnering, and learning. The fourth one is be kind to yourself. Nobody knows what's going on, so don't fake it. Nobody knows. We're just figuring it out.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And speaking, it sort of leads us really nicely actually into the next question, which is about predictions. So bearing in mind, nobody really knows what's coming, but what is your prediction for the future of the industry?
Very bright. So I'm extremely optimistic for the future of the marketing industry. So I'm defining the industry as marketing. I'm not defining the industry as media or creativity or advertising or technology, because I think it's a blur. So I'm just calling it the future of marketing.
Yeah.
Subsections like the future of advertising is in decline, right? The future of marketing, I think, is in renaissance. I think the future of creativity is in renaissance. And there are three reasons why I believe so. The first reason is 40 years ago, when I first started to learn about marketing at the University of Chicago, there was a book by the Professor Kotler of Northwestern who said marketing is about understanding and meeting customer requirements. And over the last 40 years, especially the last 10 or 15, with companies like Google, among others, we have been empowered as people more than ever before. And so marketers have to understand our requirements. And if marketing is about understanding and meeting customer requirements, and you have to understand my requirements, marketers have to do a better job, and therefore will become more better, and they'll be more important. That's one reason that I believe it's important. The second reason why I believe it's important is, and this is clearly showing both my biases and sides, but I believe that marketing is going to become the big differentiator for most companies, because marketing is going to be everything from attracting and retaining talent and talent advocacy to creating amazing experiences and everything else, because almost all the other stuff has become a commodity. I believe technology, because of cloud, has become a commodity. A lot of data has become a commodity. Financial stuff has become a commodity. Those are not differentiating advantages. People and creativity becomes a differentiating advantage. And creativity broadly, I'm not talking about a commercial, ideas, innovation, insights, culture. That's a big thing. And finally, I believe that overall, the world keeps getting better, though any particular individual, any particular time is going to have a tough time. But I remind people, okay, you just watched an hour of CNN or Fox or whatever TV, and you're terrified out of your mind, which is exactly what happens. Okay, calm yourself down for a second and just think. And we've had a very hard 2 years around the world because of COVID. So a lot of problems. But just think back from now to 20 years ago. And think about if you were a person of color, if you were a woman, if you wanted content, if you wanted your voice to be heard, if you were suffering from cancer, where would you rather be? The world is getting better. We're entering an amazing age of creativity. Marketing is going to get more important. So my prediction is I'm bullish, but it's pragmatically enthusiastic, which is it will be difficult, but I'm enthusiastic. And my basic belief is optimism often drives the future. Pessimism just sells newspapers.
I'm so glad to hear your optimism there, Rishad. And I think, I mean, there's been actually quite a theme through what your answers here. And if I can sort of pick out two words that kind of capture it for me. So one of them was imagination. You've used the word imagine and imagination quite a lot. And I think probably also empathy as well. So the ability to empathize and that sort of human aspect on top of the data. There was a lovely quote, actually, which I have to use because it was from Marcel Proust. Actually, I think you had it in one of your posts, and it was he said it's not to visit strange lands, but to possess other eyes. That is the only true voyage. That was it, wasn't it? So it's not to visit strange lands, but it's to possess other eyes. That is the only true voyage. I thought that was a wonderful way of just thinking about empathy. So could I just ask you about those two words finally? So empathy and imagination. They feel like big themes for you.
They're very big themes because to me, they basically bring the humanity into everything that we are doing. And I remind people that technology has been around since the advent of fire. And every advance in technology has given birth to an amazing age of both creativity and human potential, which is why I use imagination and empathy, right? And technology has always been the handmaiden of creativity and humanity, and not necessarily people being servants to technology. And sometimes when we are in a place today where we think, there's a bunch of, you know, that we're living in this surveillance state and everything else. Yes, to a certain extent, we're living in a surveillance state, but we can take back the state if we want to. So, and Web 3.0 may be one of those ways. So, my whole basic belief is imagination and empathy is the reason to be alive. And when we are dead, you can be cold and sterile and data driven.
Brilliant. So let me just ask you our final question here, which is my kind of capital question, really, which is what's the question that you wished I'd asked you, and what's your answer to that?
I would basically say, I think you've asked me all the interesting sort of questions, but the question that I don't think I wish you would ask me, but a question that sometimes people do ask me is, how do I learn? Okay.
Right.
Because a lot of people are somewhat fascinated. I'm now 62 years old. I'm behaving like I'm an 18-year-old student. Okay. So they said, how are you managing to fool people that you know what you're talking about when it's clear you may probably not? I think I do, but I'm not sure. And I do that by suggesting the following three things. And I would ask everyone in the world who's listening to this to do these three things. It doesn't cost you anything. It costs you a little bit of time, but that's about it. Spend an hour every day learning. Because the day you stop learning is the day you start dying. Number one. Number two, from time to time, build a case for the exact opposite of what you believe. Today, because of the way we surround ourselves with our own media, because of algorithmic feeds, we begin to believe that our flatulence smells like Chanel 5. And it often doesn't. So build a case. And third is, you know what? You got to do stuff, right? I learned how to do Substack. I learned, how to do this whole crypto stuff and learn how to do NFTs, etc. And by learning is how you do it. So, so learn, build the opposite case, and from time to time do. And you'll be very positive because you'll start at least thinking to yourself, if nothing else, that you're relevant. And so that would be what I'd say.
Fantastic. That's a great way to draw the episode to a close. So thank you, Rishad. Thank you so much for being part of Firestarters.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation.
No problem at all. And for everybody watching, don't forget to like and subscribe, of course, and share the video. But thank you for watching. And my thanks again go to Rishad. Thank you.